There was a kind of silence I never expected to find in my own home. Not the comfortable kind you settle into after dinner, when the house is warm and the news is on low and everything feels exactly as it should. This was different. This was the silence of a room that had been emptied of something essential, not furniture, not objects, but the invisible weight of 31 years. The kind of silence that doesn't ask you how you're doing, it just sits there and waits. I stood in the kitchen of our house in Oakville, Ontario, holding my phone, staring at a number on the screen that didn't make sense. I'd logged into our joint account, something I hadn't done in months, maybe longer, because my wife had asked me, casually, over breakfast 2 weeks earlier, whether I'd looked into moving some of our retirement savings into a different vehicle. She said she'd read something about interest rates. I said I'd look into it. I hadn't. That morning, I finally did. The balance was $412. I read it 3 times. I put the phone down. I picked it up again. $412. Our joint checking. Our joint savings. The RRSP transfer account we used as a buffer, all of it. Gone. What remained looked less like a balance and more like an insult. My name is Gordon Whitfield. I'm 63 years old. I spent 38 years working in commercial project management across southern Ontario, most of that with the same firm out of Burlington. I'm not a man who panics easily. I've managed million-dollar timelines, contractor disputes, city permit nightmares. I know how to stay calm when things go wrong. But standing in that kitchen, in the house I'd helped pay for over 22 years, looking at $412 in an account that should have held close to $200,000, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a young man, starting out with nothing. I felt completely exposed. My wife and I had been married for 31 years. She was 58. We had met at a conference in Hamilton back in 1993, when I was 32 and she was 27, and she laughed at something I said. I can't even remember what, and I decided I was going to marry her before the weekend was over. It took me 3 more years to actually do it, but I never changed my mind. We had a son together. He was 26 now, living in Calgary, working in oil and gas. He called on Sundays most weeks and came home at Christmas when he could. My wife and I had built a life that looked, from the outside, like exactly what you'd hope for. A house in a good neighborhood, retirement on the horizon, 22 years of a mortgage, finally done, grandchildren, eventually, maybe. A future that felt solid. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters. The last few years hadn't been easy between us. I knew that. I'd noticed the distance the way you notice a slow leak. You're aware something isn't right, but you keep believing it'll sort itself out, that you just need a warmer season or a little more time. We didn't fight. That was part of the problem. We were polite. We were careful. We had separate routines and occasionally shared meals, and sometimes sat together watching television without really watching it. I told myself that was just what a long marriage looked like after the kids grew up and the big milestones passed. I told myself a lot of things. What I didn't do was ask her directly, "What's happening with us? Are you unhappy? Where did you go?" I didn't ask, because some part of me was afraid of the answer. I called the bank from the kitchen. They were professional and calm, and essentially useless. Everything had been done correctly, they said. All transactions were authorized. My wife was a joint account holder. She had every legal right to move those funds. When I asked where the money had gone, they said they could only tell me that the transfers had been made to an external account, one registered solely in her name. An account I hadn't known existed. I sat down at the kitchen table. Outside, it was early April, that particular Canadian spring where the snow is finally gone, but the ground is still gray and unconvinced, and the trees haven't decided yet whether to trust the warmth. I remember looking out the window at the backyard, the garden she'd planted along the fence, the 2 chairs we kept on the patio, the bird feeder I'd put up 3 winters ago because she said she wanted to watch the chickadees, and thinking, how long had she been planning this? She came home around 6. I heard her car in the driveway. I heard the front door. I heard her put her keys in the bowl by the entrance the way she always did, that small ceramic bowl her mother had given her, painted with blue flowers. I didn't move from the kitchen table. She walked in, looked at me, and she knew. I could see it immediately, not guilt, exactly, but recognition. She'd been waiting for this moment, preparing for it, and now here it was. I asked her simply, "Where is the money?" She didn't flinch. She set her bag down on the counter, poured herself a glass of water, and said, "It's in my account. I moved it last month." I asked her why. She said, "Because I'm leaving, Gordon. I've been trying to find the right time to tell you, but there isn't one. I'm leaving." I asked her if there was someone else. There was a pause. Not a long one. "Yes," she said, "there is. His name, I would later learn, was Terrence. He was 52. He ran a landscaping business out of Mississauga. They had met the previous summer through a mutual friend at a backyard gathering I hadn't attended because I'd been working late on a project deadline. She had known him for 9 months. She had been planning this, in some form, for at least 6. That night, she told me she wanted me out of the house by the weekend. She said she'd consulted a lawyer. She said the house, though jointly owned, could be dealt with through the separation process, but that in the meantime she intended to stay, and she thought it would be better for both of us if I found somewhere else to go. She said this with a kind of practiced composure that told me she'd rehearsed it, probably many times. I asked her about the money. I asked her how she could justify taking everything from a joint account without telling me. She looked at me for a moment across the kitchen, across 31 years, across the table where we'd had 1,000 meals, where our son had done his homework, where we'd opened Christmas cards, and planned vacations, and talked about retirement, as though it was something we were building together. And she said, with a quiet certainty that I will not forget for as long as I live, "You'll be fine, Gordon. You always land on your feet. You didn't need me to get where you are, and you don't need me to keep going. You're capable." She meant it to be dismissive. She meant it to be a closing statement. What she did not realize, in that moment, was that she had just handed me back something I didn't know I'd lost. I left the kitchen. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of our bed, my bed, the bed I'd slept in for 22 years, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. I didn't try to push it away or rationalize it. I just sat with it. The betrayal, the money, the months she'd spent planning while I sat across from her at dinner and thought things were difficult but manageable. The man she'd chosen, the account she'd opened, the lawyer she'd already hired. I sat there for 20 minutes. And then I picked up my phone and I called my own lawyer. His name was Paul Okafor. We'd worked together years ago on a commercial property dispute, and I trusted him completely. It was 7:30 in the evening, and he answered on the third ring. I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief silence, and then he said, "Gordon, don't move anything. Don't sign anything, and don't leave voluntarily. I'll call you first thing tomorrow morning." That last part mattered more than I knew at the time. Don't leave voluntarily. If I'd packed my bags and gone to a hotel that weekend, as my wife had suggested, I would have weakened my position in a property dispute before it even began. Paul understood the mechanics of these situations in a way I didn't. I was grateful I called him when I did, and not a week later. I did not leave the house that weekend. My wife was not pleased. There were tense mornings and long silences, and one evening where she made it very clear that my presence was unwelcome. I said very little. I focused on what Paul had told me. Document everything. Respond to nothing emotionally. Let the process work. Paul filed an emergency motion within 72 hours to freeze the external account my wife had transferred the funds into. The bank had confirmed the transfer amount, $187,000. Nearly all of our liquid savings. Left in the account when she moved it, $412. He later told me it appeared she had believed that I was unlikely to act quickly, that I would be too emotionally overwhelmed to respond with any legal precision. She had underestimated me. Or rather, she had misjudged the man she thought I was, the polite, steady, non-confrontational man who kept the peace and let things slide and confused patience for passivity. They are not the same thing. During those first 2 weeks, I did something else Paul recommended. I went through every financial record I could access, tax returns going back 10 years, investment statements, the mortgage documents, every joint account statement I could pull. Not because I needed to build a case from scratch, Paul had people for that, but because I needed to understand what had actually happened. How long had she been moving small amounts? Were there other accounts I didn't know about? Had any of our shared assets been quietly repositioned? What I found was sobering. Over the previous 14 months, she had made a series of smaller withdrawals, nothing individually alarming, amounts between $800 and $3,000, that totaled just over $41,000, moved to accounts I had no knowledge of. This was separate from the large transfer. It had been a slow, careful preparation. She had been building her exit for over a year while I was going to work, managing projects, mowing the lawn on weekends, and telling myself that the distance between us was just a phase. I want to stop here for a moment, because I think this is important. I was not blameless in the failure of my marriage. I want to be honest about that. I had prioritized my career over my relationship for years. I had been present in the house, but absent in the way that actually matters emotionally, attentively, genuinely. I had stopped asking my wife how she was, and actually listening to the answer. I had assumed that stability was the same as intimacy, that providing for a household was the same as being a partner. It isn't. I know that now in a way I didn't then, and I carry that knowledge with me. A marriage doesn't hollow out overnight. It hollows out in the small moments of neglect, the questions not asked, the evenings spent in separate rooms, the gradual drift that you both sense but neither one addresses. I am not excusing what she did. Taking money from a joint account without disclosure, preparing a secret financial exit while continuing to live as though everything was normal, that is a betrayal. Full stop. But I am also not pretending I had nothing to do with the state of our marriage. I did, and understanding that has been one of the harder and more necessary parts of this whole experience. What I could not accept, what I refused to accept, was being left with nothing, not because of pride, because of fairness, because that money represented decades of work, of contribution, of a life built together. It belonged to both of us, and I was going to make sure it was treated that way. 3 weeks after I called Paul, the emergency motion succeeded. The external account was frozen, pending the divorce proceedings. My wife's lawyer filed a counter-motion, arguing that she had acted within her rights as a joint account holder. Paul argued that the transfers, combined with the undisclosed accumulation over 14 months, constituted financial misconduct in anticipation of separation, a pattern designed to disadvantage me before I had any knowledge of the impending split. The courts in Ontario take this seriously. It took several months and considerable legal fees, but the final settlement included a full accounting of all assets transferred and a division that was, in the end, genuinely equitable. The house was sold. We split the proceeds. The retirement funds were divided according to the separation agreement. I came out of it with less than I would have had if the marriage had simply continued as planned, but far more than I would have had if I'd walked out that weekend with a suitcase and trusted that things would sort themselves out. I rented a small condo in Burlington, about a 15-minute drive from the house I'd lived in for 22 years. The first few weeks were strange in the way that any radical reduction in space can be. I kept reaching for things that weren't there, kept expecting the familiar sounds of a shared home, kept waking up at 3 in the morning with a specific quality of quiet that felt less like peace and more like absence. But slowly, and then more quickly than I expected, it began to feel like mine. I bought a coffee maker I actually liked. I reorganized the closet the way I wanted it. I called my son on a Tuesday evening, just because, and we talked for an hour about nothing in particular, and it was one of the best conversations we'd had in years. My son was angry on my behalf, in the way that adult children are when they learn a parent has been hurt. He wanted to say sharp things about his mother. I asked him not to. She was still his mother. Whatever had happened between us was ours to carry, not his. He could be disappointed without needing to choose sides. He appreciated that, I think, even though it wasn't easy for either of us to navigate. I also did something I hadn't done in probably 15 years. I started going to the gym. Nothing dramatic, 40 minutes, 3 times a week, the elliptical and some light weights, and occasionally the pool. I'd been meaning to for years. I'd always had a reason not to. Now I had no particular reason not to, and the time in the morning when I would have sat reading the paper in companionable half-silence instead became something I did for myself, something small and regular and mine. About 4 months after my wife and I separated, I got a phone call. I was sitting at my kitchen table in the condo, going over some contractor proposals for a small consulting project I'd taken on in semi-retirement. It was a Thursday afternoon, late October, the light already going early the way it does in Ontario by that point in the year. My phone lit up on the table. It was her. I looked at the screen for a moment. I let it ring twice more. Then I answered. Her voice was different, not the composed, rehearsed voice from the kitchen that April evening. This was something else, thinner, less certain. She said she was sorry to call. She said she didn't know who else to reach out to. She said things had become complicated. Very complicated, was the phrase she used, in the careful way people use careful language when they don't want to say the actual thing. I asked her what had happened. It came out in pieces, and I'll tell you what I understood. Terence, the man she had left me for, the man for whom she had spent 14 months quietly draining a shared financial life, had, it turned out, significant debts. His landscaping business was not doing well. It had not been doing well for some time. She had moved $200,000 into her personal account, and in the months since the freeze and the legal proceedings, she had spent considerably on legal fees and, before the freeze, had also transferred a portion of the funds, she was vague about how much, into a joint account she had opened with him. His creditors had found it. I sat with that for a moment. I asked her what she was asking of me. There was a long pause, and then she said, I needed to hear a familiar voice. I made a mistake, Gordon. I think I made a very big mistake. I was quiet for what felt like a full minute, but was probably 10 seconds, and I thought about everything. The kitchen table, the $412, the 14 months of quiet withdrawals, the practiced composure, the weekend she asked me to leave, the ceramic bowl with the blue flowers that had been there in the entrance of my home for 2 decades. And then I thought about Paul's voice on the phone that first evening. Don't leave voluntarily. And I thought about my son's voice on a Tuesday call. And I thought about the gym on Wednesday mornings and the coffee maker I actually liked, and the condo that was starting, slowly, to feel like mine. I said, I'm sorry that happened to you. I genuinely am. But I'm not able to help you with this. You need to talk to your lawyer. She started to say something else. I said gently, because I am not a cruel man, and I did not want to be. I hope you find your footing. I really do. Take care of yourself. And I ended the call. I put the phone face down on the table. I looked out the window at the street below, the October leaves on the sidewalk, orange and rust, the kind of afternoon light that makes everything look a little more significant than it probably is. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not vindication. Something quieter than that. Something more like the particular lightness that comes when you realize you are no longer carrying something that was never yours to carry in the first place. I went back to the contractor proposals. I finished them by 5. I made dinner pasta. Nothing complicated, and I ate it at my kitchen table, and I read for an hour afterward, and I slept that night better than I had in months. My divorce was finalized the following spring. It was not painless. It was not cheap. It was not anything I would have chosen. But it was fair, and it was done, and I was on the other side of it. I am 63 years old. I have a consulting practice that keeps me busy without consuming me. I have a son in Calgary who calls on Sundays and came home last Christmas and stayed for 10 days. I have a condo in Burlington that is comfortable and quiet, and mine. I have a coffee maker I like, and a gym routine I keep, and a bird feeder on the small balcony that I put up last November, because it turns out I also like watching the chickadees. Some things you rebuild. Some things you simply build new. Here is what I know now that I wish I had known earlier. Financial transparency in a marriage is not a romantic topic, but it is a necessary one. Both partners should have full visibility into every account, every asset, every liability, not as a matter of distrust, but as a matter of partnership. The moment one person in a couple begins managing finances in secret, something has already broken. It may take months or years for the rest of the structure to show the damage, but the break is there. I also know this. When something goes wrong, when you discover, suddenly, that the ground beneath you is not what you believed it to be, the most important thing you can do is act. Not from anger, not from pride, but from clarity. Call the people who know what they're doing. Don't make decisions out of shock or grief. Don't sign things. Don't leave voluntarily. Give yourself 24 hours before you do anything significant, and use those hours to get proper counsel. Passivity is not the same as patience. I confused the two for a long time in my marriage and, if I'm honest, in other parts of my life as well. Patience is active. It's intentional. It's choosing to wait when waiting is wise. Passivity is just not choosing and hoping the situation resolves itself. It rarely does. And finally, the hardest one, know your part. I don't mean that to be used as a reason to excuse someone else's wrongdoing. What my wife did was wrong. The financial deception, The months of preparation, while we were still living as a couple, the casual suggestion that I simply leave none of that was acceptable, and I did not accept it. But I also knew, in the honest part of myself, that I had been a distant husband for years. I had stopped showing up in the ways that matter. I don't carry guilt about that anymore. I've done the work of understanding it and moving forward, but I did carry the lesson. If you are in a long relationship, show up. Ask the questions. Don't assume that the absence of conflict means the presence of connection. It doesn't. I'm not the man who stood frozen in that kitchen in Oakville, staring at $412, wondering how everything had slipped past him without his noticing. I'm the man who called his lawyer that same evening. I'm the man who stayed in the house. I'm the man who did the work, settled the accounts, and came out the other side with his integrity intact and his finances, more or less, whole. That is not nothing. In fact, at 63, after everything, it feels like quite a lot.